I never imagined that sitting in a quiet premarital counseling office, surrounded by beige walls and soft lighting, would become the moment I realized my life was in immediate danger. My name is Ashley Morgan, and at 31 years old, I was supposed to be counting down the days to my wedding, not staring at my purse with the sickening certainty that something inside it could kill me. The counselor was still arranging her notepad when I felt it, a faint but unmistakable shift beside my chair. I told myself it was nerves, wedding jitters, anything but what my body was screaming at me to acknowledge. Then it happened again, stronger this time. My stomach dropped as if the floor had vanished beneath me. I reached for my purse with shaking fingers and cracked it open just enough to look inside. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The counselor froze, her face draining of color so fast it was like watching a light switch flip off. She stood up abruptly, holding out her hand, her voice tight and urgent as she whispered, "Close that bag, slowly. Where did you bring this from?" In that instant, I understood two terrifying truths at once. First, whatever was in my purse did not belong there by accident. And second, someone I trusted had put it there knowing exactly what could happen to me. I grabbed the purse, heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, and walked out of that office knowing nothing about my wedding, or my family, would ever be the same again. I don't remember much of the walk to my car. My legs moved on their own, stiff and unsteady, while my mind raced ahead to consequences I couldn't yet name. I placed the purse on the passenger seat as carefully as if it were a bomb, then sat behind the wheel with my hands clenched in my lap, fighting the urge to throw up. The counselor's words echoed in my head. Where did you bring this from? The real question was who put it there. And deep down, I already knew the answer. I didn't drive home. I couldn't. The idea of walking back into that house, of facing the people who had been urging me to attend that counseling session, made my chest tighten. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove aimlessly for several minutes, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to think. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had wanted me in that office with that purse at that exact time, and they had counted on me being too distracted, too trusting to notice until it was too late. As I sat at a red light, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from my sister. "How did counseling go?" she asked, followed by a heart emoji. My hands started to shake again. Just days earlier, I had watched her casually go through that same purse while I was distracted, standing on a platform in a bridal boutique, wrapped in layers of white tulle. I had seen it happen and told myself it didn't matter. She was family. She wouldn't do anything to hurt me. I had been so focused on keeping the peace, on making sure nothing spoiled the happiness everyone expected from me, that I ignored the warning signs flashing right in front of my face. The truth was, this hadn't started today. It hadn't even started at the counseling office. It had started months earlier when my wedding stopped being about love and started becoming leverage. I had convinced myself that stress explained everything, the tension at home, the constant criticism, the way my confidence seemed to erode a little more each day. I blamed myself for feeling overwhelmed, for snapping when I should have stayed calm, for doubting people who insisted they only wanted what was best for me. Sitting there with my engine idling and my purse untouched beside me, I finally admitted what I had been avoiding. Someone had been working very hard to make me doubt my own instincts. Someone had been counting on me being polite, agreeable, and desperate to keep my family together long enough for them to act. Whatever had been placed in my bag was meant to look like an accident, a tragic, unfortunate event that would derail my wedding and silence me before I could question anything. I thought about how many times I had swallowed my discomfort over the past few months, how often I had chosen harmony over honesty. I had told myself that once the wedding was over, things would settle down, that once everyone saw me happily married, the pressure would ease. Now I understood how wrong I had been. The wedding wasn't the end of the tension, it was the deadline. I started the car again, this time with purpose. I wasn't ready to confront anyone yet. I didn't know who all was involved or how far this went, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't imagining this, and I wasn't safe pretending everything was fine. As I drove away from the counseling center, I made a silent promise to myself. I would stop ignoring the quiet voice that had been trying to warn me all along. Whatever I was walking into next, I would do it with my eyes open. 6 months earlier, before the counseling office and the purse and the moment everything cracked open, my phone rang late one evening, while I was folding laundry at the kitchen table. I remember the exact sound of it buzzing against the wood, because something in my chest tightened before I even looked at the screen. It was my mother. She never called that late unless something was wrong. Her voice was already unsteady when I answered, layered with urgency and accusation all at once. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask how the wedding planning was going. She went straight to the point, telling me my sister was in trouble and needed a place to stay immediately. According to her, it was a misunderstanding with a landlord, a few payments behind, nothing serious. The kind of thing family was supposed to step in and fix. I hesitated, explaining that my life was already full. The house felt smaller with every wedding box stacked in the corner, every checklist taped to the fridge. I said I needed to think about it. That was a mistake. My father took the phone from her, his tone sharp and disappointed, reminding me that I had the space, the stability, the good job. He said my sister didn't have anyone else. He said I was forgetting where I came from. By the end of the call, I was apologizing for even hesitating. She arrived 2 days later with 3 oversized suitcases and no plan to leave. There was no embarrassment in the way she stepped through my front door, no gratitude in her voice as she looked around my living room like a guest checking into a hotel. She commented on the furniture, the colors, the way I had organized my space, as if she were already settling in and making mental notes about what she would change. I told myself she was just stressed. I told myself it was temporary. From the very beginning, my parents spoke about her stay as if it were an open-ended arrangement. They called daily, sometimes more than once, not to ask how things were going between us, but to give instructions. Don't push her to look for work yet. She needs time. Be patient with her. She's been through so much. Every sentence ended with the same reminder. She's your sister. I tried to believe that opening my home was the right thing to do, especially with my wedding so close. I wanted to start this next chapter of my life without guilt clinging to me. I wanted my parents' approval. I wanted peace. What I didn't realize was how quickly peace would turn into silence. She made herself comfortable in ways that felt small at first. Borrowing things without asking. Moving items around because she thought they made more sense somewhere else. Sitting at the kitchen counter while I worked on seating charts, offering unsolicited opinions about who should be invited and who shouldn't. She spoke as if she had a say, as if my wedding were a group project she had been assigned to oversee. Whenever I tried to set a boundary, even gently, the mood shifted instantly. She would sigh, look hurt, and retreat to her room. Within minutes, my phone would buzz with a message from my mother asking what I had said to upset her. My father would follow with a lecture about sensitivity and compassion. Somehow I always ended up reassuring them that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. The house stopped feeling like mine. It became a place where I watched my words carefully, where I measured my reactions, where I avoided conflict by shrinking myself just enough to get through the day. I told myself it was wedding stress, that once the ceremony was over, things would settle back into place. Looking back, there were signs I should have paid attention to. Questions she asked that didn't quite fit casual conversation. Comments about money that felt too specific. Curiosity about paperwork I kept in my office. Once, I caught her holding my purse, rifling through it as if she were looking for something. I was standing on a small platform in a bridal boutique at the time, half-dressed, distracted by mirrors and fabric and the weight of expectation. I laughed it off, assuming she was just nosy. Family always crossed lines, I told myself. It didn't mean anything. My parents praised her constantly for trying to help, for being involved, for caring so much about my well-being. They spoke about me as if I were fragile, as if the pressure of planning a wedding had made me unreliable. It was subtle, always wrapped in concern, but it stuck. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I really was more irritable than usual. more forgetful, less capable than I had always believed. The more I tried to keep everything running smoothly, the more off balance I felt. And the more off balance I seemed, the more everyone else leaned into the narrative that I needed guidance, that I needed help, that I needed to be watched. I didn't know it then, but letting my sister stay wasn't just a favor, it was an invitation. I had opened the door at the exact moment my life was most exposed, when I was trying hardest to please everyone else. My wedding, which should have been a symbol of independence and joy, quietly became a tool, a deadline, a point of pressure they could push against without ever appearing cruel. If I had understood that sooner, I might have acted differently. But at the time, all I could see was my family, standing together, waiting for me to fall in line. And like I always had, I did. The closer my wedding date crept, the more my life stopped feeling like it belonged to me. What should have been an exciting countdown turned into a series of small concessions I didn't remember agreeing to. My sister inserted herself into every decision, as if she had always been part of the plan. She commented on venues, questioned my dress choice, suggested changes to the guest list, and spoke to vendors without asking. Each time she smiled and said she was only trying to help because I seemed overwhelmed. At first, I pushed back gently. I reminded her that I had things under control, that I had already made these choices. Her response was always the same. She would tilt her head, soften her voice, and say she was worried about me. She said I looked exhausted. She said planning a wedding could break people. She said she'd seen it happen before. The way she said it made it sound less like an opinion and more like a diagnosis. Before long, my parents started repeating the same concerns. They called to ask if I was sleeping enough, if I was eating properly, if I was sure I wasn't taking on too much. It was strange how closely their words mirrored hers, right down to the phrasing. When I pointed that out, they laughed it off and said they were all just worried about me. I was the one getting married, after all. Of course I was stressed. What bothered me wasn't the concern. It was the way it replaced my voice. Conversations about my wedding began happening around me instead of with me. Decisions I thought were settled resurfaced as open questions. When I asserted myself, I was told to calm down. When I insisted, I was accused of snapping. Somehow, every attempt to stand my ground became evidence that I was losing control. My sister had a way of positioning herself as the reasonable one. She would speak softly, offer compromises, remind everyone that she was only thinking about what was best for me. If I reacted emotionally, even briefly, she would glance at my parents with a look that said everything without saying anything at all. I started to see how easily a narrative could form when people wanted to believe it. It didn't stop at family. She began showing up to lunches with friends, casually dropping comments about how hard I was taking wedding planning. She framed it as concern, but I noticed how people's expressions changed when they looked at me afterward. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Questions were phrased more carefully, like I might break if they spoke too directly. It was subtle, but it was there. I felt myself becoming a version of me I didn't recognize, someone other people tiptoed around. At home, the atmosphere shifted. My routines were no longer mine alone. My sister kept track of when I went to bed and when I woke up. She commented on how much coffee I drank, how often I sighed, how distracted I seemed. If I forgot something small, she made a note of it. If I remembered something she claimed I'd said differently, she corrected me with certainty. I laughed it off at first, but over time, doubt crept in. One night, we argued over something insignificant, a stack of invitations I had left on the counter. She accused me of being careless. I told her she was overstepping. Her face crumpled instantly, and she accused me of attacking her when she was only trying to help. My parents called less than 10 minutes later. They told me I needed to apologize. They said I was pushing people away. I remember standing in the kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at my own reflection in the microwave door and wondering how such a small moment had spiraled so quickly. After that, I became quieter. I chose my words carefully. I stopped sharing my doubts and frustrations, even with my fiancé. I didn't want to add more strain to a relationship already under the weight of expectations and opinions. I told myself that keeping the peace was temporary, that once the wedding was over, everyone would relax, that this tension had an expiration date. But the closer that date came, the tighter everything felt. It was as if the pressure increased instead of easing. My sister became more attentive, more present, more involved. She insisted on attending appointments with me, sitting in on conversations that had once been private. She spoke for me when I hesitated, filling silences I hadn't asked her to fill. When I tried to reclaim space, I was reminded how fragile I seemed lately. I started questioning myself in ways I never had before. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I had been too harsh, too emotional, too forgetful. I blamed hormones, stress, exhaustion. It was easier than confronting the possibility that the people closest to me were actively undermining my confidence. It was easier than admitting that something was wrong. One afternoon, while flipping through my planner, I realized I had written the same reminder twice on 2 different days. I stared at the page longer than necessary, my heart beating faster for reasons I couldn't explain. My sister noticed and commented that I'd been doing things like that a lot. She said it gently, almost kindly. That was when it hit me how often she had been watching. By then, my wedding no longer felt like a celebration waiting to happen. It felt like a deadline I was racing toward without understanding what would happen when I crossed it. I sensed that something irreversible was being prepared, something that depended on me staying distracted and agreeable just a little longer. I didn't know exactly what I was up against yet, but I knew I was losing ground. And for the first time, I was afraid that by the time I understood what was happening, it would be too late to stop it. The first thing I noticed was how tired I felt, and not the kind of tired that comes from long days or restless nights. This was heavier, like my body was moving through wet cement while my mind lagged a few steps behind. I would wake up after a full night's sleep feeling as though I hadn't rested at all. Some mornings, I stood in the shower longer than usual, staring at the tile, trying to remember what I had planned for the day. I blamed the wedding. Everyone said it was normal. My sister noticed before I did, or at least she said she did. She would watch me closely, tilting her head, asking if I was feeling okay. She commented on the dark circles under my eyes, on how quiet I had become. When I brushed it off, she smiled and said she just worried about me. The way she said it made it sound like an established fact rather than a question. Then small things started disappearing. At first, it was barely worth mentioning. My keys weren't where I always left them. A pair of earrings I wore often wasn't in my jewelry dish. When I found them later in odd places, the pantry shelf, the bathroom drawer, I laughed it off. Stress makes you scatterbrained, I told myself. That's what everyone says. My sister never laughed. She would nod sympathetically and say that wedding stress can do strange things to memory. When I told my parents about it during one of their nightly calls, they agreed with her. My mother suggested I write things down more often. My father said I was probably pushing myself too hard. None of them asked if someone else might have moved my things. The exhaustion worsened. There were afternoons when I sat down for just a moment and lost track of time completely. Once I woke up on the couch, sunlight slanting through the windows at a different angle than I remembered, with no clear sense of how long I had been there. My phone showed missed messages I didn't remember hearing. When I mentioned it, my sister frowned and told me that wasn't healthy. She suggested I slow down. It was always framed as care. That was the most confusing part. Every concern was delivered gently, every warning wrapped in concern. If I questioned it, I looked defensive. If I denied it, I looked in denial. There was no response that didn't feed the story they were building. Money became another point of tension. I noticed charges on my account I didn't immediately recognize. Small amounts at first, easy to dismiss. When I brought it up, my sister said I must have forgotten. My parents reminded me how easy it is to lose track when you're overwhelmed. They suggested I let my sister help me organize my finances, at least until the wedding was over. The idea made my skin crawl, but I didn't know why. I said no, politely. The look my sister gave me was brief but sharp, gone before I could be sure I had seen it. That night, my parents called again. They told me I was being stubborn. They said I needed to accept help when it was offered. They said pride could be dangerous. Around that time, I started noticing how people outside the house treated me. Friends asked how I was doing in cautious tones. My fiancé asked if I was okay more often than usual, his concern laced with uncertainty. I overheard my sister on the phone one afternoon, her voice low and soothing, telling someone she was worried I was pushing myself too far. She said she was doing her best to protect me. I wanted to confront her. I wanted to demand she stop talking about me like I wasn't capable of managing my own life, but every time I thought about it, my chest tightened. I imagined my parents' disappointment, the accusations of selfishness, the reminders of everything my sister had supposedly endured. I stayed quiet instead. One evening, I nearly burned dinner because I forgot I had turned the oven on. The smell snapped me back to awareness just in time. My sister rushed in, alarmed, pulling the pan out with a towel. She didn't yell, she didn't scold me, she looked scared. Later, she told my parents what had happened. They called immediately, voices tight with concern, asking if I was safe living alone right now. That was when fear finally edged out confusion. Not because of the mistake, but because of how quickly it was used. It was as if every misstep was being logged, cataloged, saved for later. I started paying closer attention, not to defend myself, but to understand what was happening. The moment that stayed with me came a few days later. I had gone out to run errands and returned earlier than expected. As I walked into the house, I heard my sister's voice in the kitchen, calm and focused, speaking to someone on the phone. She stopped abruptly when she saw me. The conversation ended too quickly. When I asked who she had been talking to, she smiled and said it was nothing important. Her calm unsettled me. It didn't match the constant concern she showed when anyone else was watching. That night, as I lay awake, every strange incident replayed in my mind. The missing items, the exhaustion, the coordinated concern, the way my mistakes were magnified and shared. For the first time, I considered the possibility that someone benefited from me seeming unreliable, that someone needed me tired, distracted, and doubting myself. The thought made my stomach twist, but it also brought a strange clarity. I wasn't imagining things. Something was being done to me, deliberately and quietly. I didn't know the full shape of it yet. I didn't know how far it went or who all was involved, but I knew this much. Whatever was happening wasn't going to stop on its own. And if I didn't start paying attention, really paying attention, I might not get another chance to understand it at all. I stopped trying to prove I wasn't imagining things and started paying attention to what kept repeating. The pattern didn't announce itself all at once. It surfaced in fragments that refused to line up unless I looked at them side by side. A phrase my sister used that my mother repeated hours later. A concern my father voiced using the same careful wording. It was the sameness that finally broke through the fog. Concern doesn't echo like that. Coordination does. I began keeping quiet in ways that felt unnatural to me. I stopped correcting people when they misunderstood me. I nodded through conversations where my wedding plans were discussed as if I weren't sitting there. I let my sister believe I was still distracted, still overwhelmed, still willing to defer. Inside, I started taking notes, not on paper, in my head, dates, times, who said what and when. The more I observed, the clearer it became. My sister wasn't reacting to my stress. She was anticipating it. She knew when my parents would call. She knew what they would say. Once, she mentioned a bill I hadn't brought up yet, down to the exact amount. When I asked how she knew, she smiled and said I must have told her. I knew I hadn't. I started checking things I had never felt the need to question before. Bank statements, insurance paperwork, files I kept tucked away because they didn't require daily attention. That was when the unease in my stomach turned into something colder and sharper. There were documents referencing my assets that I didn't remember sharing, notes about timing, about delays, about what would be simpler if everything stayed in my name a little longer. The closer I looked, the more I understood why the wedding date mattered so much to them. Marriage would complicate things. It would introduce another voice, another set of rights, another person who might ask questions. Keeping me single a little longer wasn't just convenient, it was necessary. I didn't confront anyone. I couldn't afford to. I had seen how quickly my reactions were used against me. I had watched how easily concern turned into accusation. Instead, I leaned into the role they had given me. I let myself appear scattered. I asked for help when it was offered. I thanked my sister for worrying about me. Each time I did, her guard lowered just enough for me to see behind it. There was a moment late one evening when I heard her on the phone again, her voice hushed but urgent. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening without meaning to. She wasn't speaking with the warmth she used when she talked about me to others. This voice was clipped, transactional. She mentioned dates, she mentioned pressure. She said she needed more time. When she hung up and noticed me standing there, she startled, then laughed it off, saying she was just venting. That was when it clicked. This wasn't about helping me through a stressful season. This was about buying time, stretching things just far enough to make something else possible. I began copying what I could without leaving a trace. Screenshots, photos, notes stored somewhere only I could access. I told myself not to rush, not to spook anyone. Every instinct screamed at me to act, but I forced myself to wait. I needed proof, not just suspicion. I needed to know how far this went and who all was involved. My sister became noticeably kinder as the days passed. She brought me tea without asking. She reminded me to rest. She volunteered to handle tasks I hadn't requested help with. It was unsettling, the way her attention sharpened as my silence deepened. It felt like being watched by someone who believed the outcome was already decided. My parents, too, shifted their tone. They talked about the counseling session more insistently. They framed it as a final step, something to clear the air and set me up for a healthy marriage. They said it would be good for me to hear an outside perspective. They said they were only thinking of my future. I realized then that the session wasn't about guidance. It was about positioning, about creating a record, about placing me somewhere official, somewhere neutral, where the right narrative could take hold. My pulse quickened at the thought, but I kept my voice steady when I agreed to go. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was tired, but because everything finally made sense. The exhaustion, the missing items, the careful concern. It wasn't random. It wasn't kindness gone wrong. It was a slow, deliberate effort to make me doubt myself long enough for someone else to decide what happened next. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. I thought about how easily I had been led here by my own desire to keep the peace. How often I had chosen silence because it felt safer than conflict. Now silence had become my shield for a different reason. By morning, I had made a decision. I would go to the counseling session. I would act exactly as expected. I would let them believe I was still pliable, still unaware, still playing my part. But I would also be ready. Because whatever they were planning, it was no longer something happening around me. It was something moving toward me. And I had reached the point where pretending not to see it was more dangerous than facing it head on. The morning of the counseling session arrived too quietly, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I woke before my alarm, alert in a way I hadn't been for weeks. My sister was already up, which was unusual. She greeted me with a softness that felt rehearsed, asking if I'd slept well, if I felt ready for today. My parents had texted before sunrise, reminding me of the appointment time and how important it was to approach it with an open mind. Everything about their attention felt coordinated, like pieces sliding into place. I showered, dressed, and moved through my routine with deliberate calm. I checked my purse before leaving my bedroom, then again in the hallway, telling myself not to panic if nothing seemed out of place. By the time we reached the counseling center, my pulse had settled into a steady, controlled rhythm. I told myself to stay observant, to stay quiet. Whatever was coming would reveal itself. The waiting room was neutral and tidy, designed to make people feel safe. Soft chairs, muted artwork, a faint scent of lavender. I placed my purse beside my chair and sat with my hands folded in my lap. As the counselor greeted us and began explaining the session, I felt it. A subtle shift. A pressure that hadn't been there before. I froze, listening to my body over the sound of her voice. It happened again, unmistakable this time. A movement, contained but alive. My breath caught, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt. I told myself not to react. Not yet. I watched the counselor's eyes as she spoke, gauging how much time I had before whatever was inside my purse demanded attention. When the movement grew stronger, I reached down and nudged the purse with my foot. The counselor noticed immediately. Her sentence trailed off as she followed my gaze. I saw the change in her face before she spoke. Concern sharpened into something else. Fear, maybe. Authority. She stood up slowly and asked me to stop moving. I didn't answer. I leaned down and opened the purse just enough to confirm what my instincts had already decided. I felt my stomach drop, a cold weight settling behind my ribs. The counselor took a step back, one hand raised, her voice tight as she told me to close it. Then she asked the question that broke the room open. "Where did you bring this from?" There was no judgment in her tone, only urgency. In that moment, the session stopped being about communication and became something else entirely. An emergency. She told me to leave the building immediately and not to return home. She told me to keep the purse away from myself and others and to treat it as evidence, not an accessory. The words evidence and safety landed hard, reshaping everything I thought I understood. I stood on legs that didn't feel like mine and walked out of the office without looking back. I didn't call my sister. I didn't answer the messages already lighting up my phone. I carried the purse the way you carry something you don't trust, careful and distant, as if it might turn on me if I made the wrong move. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright, too normal. I sat in my car for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, grounding myself in the present. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't stress. It was a plan. Whatever had been placed in my purse was meant to be discovered later, under different circumstances. Somewhere private, somewhere I would be alone. I drove away from the counseling center and didn't stop until the building was far behind me. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. I let it ring. A message followed, then another. My sister texted that she was worried and asked why I'd left so abruptly. The concern came too fast, too precise. It confirmed what the counselor's reaction had already told me. I pulled into a quiet parking lot and sat there, breathing slowly, thinking through what came next. I knew better than to confront anyone directly. I had seen how quickly my words were twisted, how easily concern became a weapon. If I wanted the truth to hold, I needed witnesses, authority, distance. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to clarity. Fear was still there, but it had sharpened into focus. They had expected me to sit quietly, to doubt myself, to let the narrative carry me where they wanted. They hadn't expected a third party to see through it. They hadn't expected me to walk out. I placed the purse on the passenger seat and covered it with a jacket, as if that might contain the weight of it. My wedding, my family, the life I thought I was stepping into had all fractured in a single moment. There would be no going back to the version of events they had been preparing. As I started the engine again, I understood that the danger wasn't over. If anything, it had just been exposed. But exposure changed the rules. It meant I no longer had to protect their comfort at the expense of my safety. Whatever they had planned for me that day depended on silence and timing. I had disrupted both. And as I drove toward the next decision, the one that would put everything into motion, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer walking blindly into their version of the future. I was choosing my own way out. I didn't go back to the house after I left the counseling center. I drove straight to a place where my voice wouldn't be questioned and my fear wouldn't be labeled as stress. I sat across from people who listened without interrupting, who asked clear questions and took careful notes. For the first time in months, I wasn't being told how I felt. I was being asked what I knew. I laid everything out, slowly and deliberately: the exhaustion, the missing items, the conversations that echoed word for word, the counseling session, and what had been discovered in my purse. I handed over what I had collected quietly over the past few weeks: the screenshots, the photos, the timelines I had pieced together late at night while the house slept. As they reviewed it, I watched their expressions shift from polite attention to something heavier and more focused. This wasn't confusion, it was recognition. They told me not to answer any calls on my own. If my family reached out, they wanted to hear it. I agreed, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. I realized then that fear had finally given way to resolve. I wasn't trying to convince anyone anymore. I was letting the truth speak for itself. The calls started almost immediately. My sister texted first, asking where I had gone and why I wasn't responding. My mother followed, her messages filled with worry and urgency, telling me I was scaring everyone. Then my father called. I let it ring until I was told to answer and put it on speaker. His voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when he was trying to keep a situation from unraveling. He didn't ask if I was okay. He told me to come home so we could talk this through privately. He said misunderstandings happen. He said I was overreacting. He asked me to be reasonable. When I didn't respond the way he expected, his tone shifted. He started giving instructions. He told me what I needed to do next, where I needed to go, who I needed to speak to. He assumed I was still following a script he had helped write. Each sentence made it clearer that he knew far more than someone simply concerned should. My sister called again, her voice trembling this time. She said she was scared. She said everything had gotten out of hand. She said our parents had pressured her, that she had only been trying to help. She begged me not to let things escalate. The fear in her voice wasn't for me, it was for herself. They kept talking, filling the silence with explanations and reassurances, and with every word they revealed more than they intended. They contradicted each other. They slipped and corrected themselves. They referenced things that hadn't been said out loud. I didn't have to push. I just listened. Things moved quickly after that. I wasn't there when the house was searched. I didn't watch doors open or hear voices raised. I received updates instead, clipped and factual, letting me know what had been found and what it confirmed. There was a strange relief in being removed from the spectacle of it. I didn't need to see it to understand. What stayed with me was the silence that followed. The constant noise of messages and calls stopped all at once, like a switch being flipped. I sat alone in a quiet room and felt the weight of everything I had been carrying finally begin to lift. Not because it was over, but because it was no longer hidden. Later, I learned how quickly loyalties dissolved under pressure. My sister tried to distance herself from our parents, claiming she had been manipulated, that she hadn't known how far things would go. My parents, in turn, insisted they had only been trying to protect me, that everything had been misunderstood. It was painful to realize how conditional their version of family had always been. When consequences appeared, the unity they had presented for so long collapsed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. And then, slowly, steady. I understood that I hadn't caused this outcome. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stopped absorbing the damage quietly. The truth had done the rest. My fiancé reached out that night. His voice was careful, uncertain, filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. I answered what I could, honestly and without embellishment. I told him I needed time. Not to punish him, but to find solid ground again. He said he understood. I wasn't sure if he did, but for the first time I wasn't bending myself into a shape that made others comfortable. As the days passed, the reality of what had happened settled in. The wedding plans were suspended, then quietly undone. Boxes were returned, deposits were discussed. Each step felt surreal, like dismantling a future I had been walking toward without seeing where it led. I grieved that loss, even as I recognized it had saved me. At night, I replayed conversations in my head, not with regret, but with clarity. I saw the moments where I had gone silent instead of speaking, where I had chosen peace over truth. I didn't blame myself for those choices anymore. I understood why I had made them, but I also knew I would never make them again. By the end of that week, I was exhausted in a different way, not drained but emptied, cleared out. I stood at a window one evening, watching the light fade, and realized that surviving them hadn't freed me yet. Survival was only the first step. Freedom would come next. The weeks that followed moved at two different speeds. On the surface, everything happened quickly. Decisions were made, papers were signed, conversations ended before they could spiral. But underneath all of that, time stretched in a way I wasn't prepared for. Every quiet moment carried the weight of what had almost happened, and what would never happen now. The legal outcomes came first, delivered without drama. My sister faced consequences that stripped away the image she had built for herself, the one that relied on sympathy and proximity. My parents were forced to reckon with choices they could no longer explain away as concern. There were no emotional speeches, no apologies that meant anything, just the slow, unavoidable settling of accountability. Watching it unfold from a distance was strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Justice, I learned, doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like relief. Canceling the wedding was harder than I expected, even though I knew it was the right choice. It wasn't just about the relationship. It was about letting go of a future I had already lived in my mind. The dress hanging in the closet. The plans written in ink. The version of myself who believed everything would fall into place if she just tried harder. I mourned her quietly. Then I packed the dress away and closed the door. People asked if I was devastated. I told them the truth. I was sad, but I was also clear. Sadness didn't mean regret. Choosing my safety over a ceremony didn't make me weak. It made me honest. For the first time in a long while, my decisions weren't shaped by fear of disappointing anyone else. I moved out of the house shortly after. Not in a dramatic rush, but deliberately. Every room held echoes of conversations I had swallowed and instincts I had ignored. I didn't want to carry those echoes with me. I found a smaller place in a quieter neighborhood, somewhere anonymous enough to breathe. I didn't tell my family where I was going. That boundary felt firm and necessary. They tried to reach out anyway, messages framed as concern, requests for forgiveness that skipped over responsibility. I didn't respond. Silence, I realized, could be an act of self-respect when it was chosen freely. Cutting ties wasn't about punishment, it was about survival, about refusing to step back into a dynamic that had nearly destroyed me. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, sleeping through the night without waking in a panic, leaving my purse unattended without feeling my chest tighten, trusting my memory again, trusting my judgment. Each small moment felt like reclaiming something that had been taken quietly over time. I thought often about how close I had come to losing everything without ever understanding why, about how easily concern can disguise control, and how family loyalty can be used to silence intuition. I used to believe that enduring discomfort was the price of belonging. Now I know better. Belonging should never require you to erase yourself. The hardest lesson was accepting that love does not always come from the people who share your blood. Sometimes it comes from the voice inside you that refuses to be quiet any longer, the one that says something is wrong even when everyone else insists it's fine. Learning to listen to that voice changed everything. I don't regret walking away. I regret the time I spent believing I had to stay. Walking away didn't make me cold or ungrateful. It saved my life. And saving your life is never something you owe an apology for. If you've stayed with me until now, I want to thank you. Sharing this story isn't easy, but I know how powerful it can be to hear someone say the things you've been afraid to admit to yourself. If you've ever ignored a warning sign to keep the peace, or felt pressured to sacrifice your safety for the sake of family, you're not alone. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Do you think I made the right choice by cutting ties and walking away, or would you have handled it differently? Please share your perspective in the comments. Your stories and experiences matter here. And if you want to hear more real stories about standing up to betrayal, setting boundaries, and finding your way back to yourself, stay with this channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and take care of yourself until the next time we talk. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.